The mansion stood tall and silent at the edge of the city, its marble walls gleaming in the moonlight, but inside there was no peace. Only the restless sound of two children crying into the night, their small voices echoing through the wide hallways, like a haunting reminder of a loss too heavy for their young hearts. And their father, a wealthy widower who could buy almost anything in the world, sat in his study with tired eyes, staring at the flickering fire in the fireplace, feeling utterly powerless because no amount of money could silence the tears of his twins, who had not slept properly since their mother passed away. And each night he walked slowly up the grand staircase, pausing outside their bedroom door, listening to their sobs, his heart breaking all over again. But when he pushed the door open, the twins looked at him with wide, fearful eyes, as if his presence only reminded them of the absence of the one they longed for, their mother, and he would sit by their bedside, telling them that everything was fine, that they were safe. Yet his words felt empty even to himself, because he knew they were not afraid of monsters in the closet or shadows on the wall, but of the emptiness in their lives. And so, night after night, he sat helplessly, offering toys, books, even sweet treats, anything to distract them. But nothing worked. Their tears only grew louder when the house grew quiet, and the widower wondered if he had failed as both a father and a protector. For what good was his wealth if he could not give his children the simple gift of sleep? And as the nights stretched on, the staff whispered among themselves about the sadness that clung to the children like a shadow, and some left because they could not bear the sound of crying that never seemed to end, leaving the widower more desperate than ever, searching for help but finding none, until one evening when exhaustion weighed so heavily on him that he nearly fell asleep in the chair outside their room. He realized that if something did not change, if he did not find someone who could reach into the hearts of his children and ease their pain, then the sleepless nights would destroy not only them but him as well. And though he had lived through the pain of losing his wife, he now faced a new fear, the possibility that grief might steal away the light from his children forever. And as the grandfather clock struck midnight, its chime echoing through the stillness of the house, he buried his face in his hands, whispering a silent plea for help, not knowing that soon an unexpected answer would walk through the grand doors of his mansion and change everything in ways he could not yet imagine. The next morning arrived heavy with silence, the widower dragging himself to the breakfast table with dark circles beneath his eyes. His children slumped beside him like two shadows of their former selves, eyes half open and movements slow, and he knew something had to change before the sorrow completely swallowed them. So when the butler quietly reminded him that a new nanny candidate was waiting in the sitting room, he barely lifted his head, too tired to hope but desperate enough to try. And when he entered the room, he found a woman standing tall, her dark skin glowing in the soft morning light, her smile calm but filled with warmth, her hands folded neatly in front of her, and though she looked modest, there was a presence about her that seemed to fill the space with peace, a kind of strength that could not be bought or taught. And she introduced herself in a gentle voice, speaking not of qualifications or experience, but of her love for children and her belief that no child should cry themselves to sleep. And something in the widower's heart stirred, though he did not show it, only nodding and telling her she could start immediately. And that night, when the mansion fell into its usual restless silence, she climbed the stairs quietly, her footsteps soft but sure, and entered the twins' room where the children lay tossing and turning, clutching their blankets tightly, their faces pale from exhaustion. And instead of commanding them to sleep or offering bribes like the others before her, she simply sat between their beds, humming softly at first, a tune so low it was barely more than a whisper, but slowly the melody wrapped around the children like a warm blanket, and they turned their tired eyes toward her, their breathing slowing as if the sound carried away the heaviness in their hearts. And she began to speak, not of fairy tales or fantasies but of love, of a mother's embrace that lived in their hearts, reminding them that even though she was gone, her love had not disappeared but lived in every memory, every smile, every heartbeat. And the twins listened, their little hands unclenching as though for the first time in months they dared to let go of fear. And when the widower, too restless to stay away, stood outside the door and peeked through the crack, what he saw froze him in place. For the children who had refused every comfort now reached for the nanny's hands, pressing close as though they had known her forever, and within moments their eyes fluttered shut, their breathing deepened, and for the first time since their mother's passing, sleep finally found them, soft and deep. And he stood there speechless, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that even the faintest sound would break the fragile miracle unfolding before him. And as he watched her stroke their hair with such care, whispering promises that they were safe and loved, something in his chest that had been locked away since his wife's death shifted ever so slightly, like a door beginning to open. And though he did not yet understand why this woman, a stranger only hours ago, could do what no one else had managed, he knew that she was no ordinary presence, that there was something unexplainable about the way she carried calm into chaos and gave comfort where there was only despair. And as he finally stepped back, retreating silently into the hallway, his heart pounded not with fear but with a strange mixture of awe and hope. a feeling he had almost forgotten. And that night the mansion was not haunted by tears or restless cries but filled with silence, a silence that was no longer heavy with grief but peaceful. And though the widower lay awake in his bed, unable to sleep from the shock of what he had witnessed, he realized that perhaps the answer he had been pleading for had arrived, wrapped not in wealth or grandeur, but in the gentle presence of a woman who carried healing in her voice and light in her soul. ChatGPT said. The following nights continued to surprise the widower. For each time he lingered by the doorway, he saw the same scene as twins surrendering to peace under the nanny's quiet presence, their small bodies finally at rest, their dreams no longer invaded by grief. Yet, while relief filled him, curiosity gnawed at the back of his mind because though she smiled with kindness and carried herself with patience, he could not ignore the shadows he sometimes caught in her eyes when she thought no one was looking, as though she too was fighting memories too heavy to bear. And one evening, after the twins had fallen asleep unusually quickly, he stayed back in the hallway instead of retreating to his study, determined to understand, and he waited, listening through the faint crack in the door. And what he heard froze him, a tremor in her voice as she whispered not to the children but to herself. A prayer mixed with fear, asking for strength to protect them, to never fail them. And in those words he heard the weight of a promise made long ago, one that carried both pain and hope. And the next morning, while the twins laughed at breakfast, their faces brighter than he had seen in months, he could not shake the need to know more. So he asked her casually about her past, but she lowered her eyes and gave only short answers, speaking about growing up in a small town, working hard to care for her younger siblings, and how she had always believed children deserved safety. Yet there was a crack in her tone, a hesitation that hinted at something unsaid. And when he pressed further, she politely excused herself to tend to the twins, leaving him with more questions than answers. And as the days passed, he noticed how she was calm in storms but flinched at sudden loud noises. How she carried the children with such protectiveness it was almost as if she feared someone would take them away. And one night, unable to hold his concern, he confronted her gently, telling her that while he was grateful for the peace she had given his children, he needed to know if there was something he should be aware of, something that might explain the look of fear she sometimes carried. And for a moment she stood silent, her hands tightening around the blankets she had been folding. And then, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, she told him that years ago she had worked for another family, a wealthy household not unlike his, but she had failed to protect the child she was hired to care for, a little boy who had suffered an accident while under her watch. And though she had done everything to save him, the guilt had never left her, and though the family had forgiven her, she had never forgiven herself. And since then, every child she cared for, she treated as her own, guarding them fiercely as if saving them would somehow erase the memory of the one she lost. And as she spoke, her eyes glistened with tears she quickly brushed away, ashamed of showing weakness. But instead of judgment, the widower felt something unexpected rise within him, not suspicion but empathy. For he too knew what it meant to live with a wound no one could see, to blame himself for what he could not prevent. And for the first time he realized that perhaps her ability to comfort his children came not in spite of her pain but because of it, that her secret fear was not a flaw but the reason she understood so deeply the cries of children, the silence of grief, and the need for gentleness. And though she tried to excuse herself after confessing, embarrassed by her vulnerability, he stopped her with a firm yet kind voice, telling her that the past did not define her, that what he saw now was a woman who had done the unthinkable, not failed, but brought peace where there was none. And as his words hung in the air, she looked at him with disbelief, her lips parting as if to argue, yet no sound came, only a quiet breath that seemed to release a piece of the weight she had carried for years. And in that unspoken moment, a fragile trust began to grow between them, a bond born not from perfection, but from brokenness. And though neither admitted it aloud, they both knew that something had shifted that night, that the walls they had built around their hearts had begun to crack. And in the silence of the mansion, filled no longer with restless cries but with a new, tentative peace, both the widower and the nanny realized that perhaps healing was not found in hiding their fears but in sharing them. And yet, as the days stretched forward, she still carried that shadow in her eyes, a reminder that secrets, no matter how gently revealed, always left echoes. And he wondered if those echoes would one day return to disturb the fragile calm they had found. One night, when the house was quiet and the twins had long drifted into sleep, the widower sat in his study, staring at old photographs of his late wife, his heart still aching with a wound that never seemed to heal. When suddenly he heard a faint cry from down the hall and rushed toward the sound, only to find the nanny already there, holding one of the twins who had woken up shaking from a nightmare. And though the widower expected her to simply soothe the child back to bed, he froze at what she did next, for she began humming a lullaby he had never heard before, a song so gentle and filled with emotion that it seemed to carry a story of its own. And the child's tears dried instantly, as if the melody itself wrapped around her like a shield. But what unsettled him was not just the effect on the child, it was the way the nanny herself seemed transformed. Her eyes closed, her voice trembling as though she was pouring every hidden memory, every grief, every fear she had ever buried into that tune. And when the other twins stirred, she rocked both of them in her arms, whispering promises that no harm would ever come to them as long as she was there. And the widower, hidden in the shadows of the doorway, felt as though he was witnessing something sacred, something beyond an ordinary act of care, almost unthinkable in its depth because it was not her job to love them this much. Yet she did, as though her soul had bound itself to theirs, and he wondered what pain could drive someone to give so completely of themselves. And in that moment he remembered her confession about the child she once lost, and it struck him with full force. This was not simply kindness, this was redemption, a desperate attempt to heal a wound by making sure no other child in her care would ever suffer again. And though he wanted to step forward, to thank her, to tell her she did not need to carry that burden alone, something in her trembling voice held him back, as if intruding would shatter the fragile honesty of the moment. So he stayed silent, watching as she laid the twins gently back in their beds, kissed their foreheads with a tenderness that almost broke him, and then quietly sat on the floor between their beds, refusing to leave their side until she was certain they slept peacefully, her back leaning against the wall, her eyes heavy with exhaustion but her expression filled with determination. And the widower realized with a start that she was not only their caretaker, she had become their guardian in a way he never expected, willing to give pieces of herself to restore what his children had lost. And as he turned away, he could not shake the thought that while he had been drowning in his grief, this woman, carrying her own silent sorrows, had stepped in and done the unthinkable, not out of obligation, not out of duty, but out of love so raw it frightened him. And as he returned to his study, he understood something for the first time, that the unthinkable act was not simply her song or her promise, but the fact that she had risked opening her broken heart again, and in doing so, she had begun to mend not just the twins, but perhaps even him, though he was not yet ready to admit it. And as the night faded into dawn, the mansion that had once been filled with only silence and grief now carried a new sound, faint yet powerful, the quiet hum of hope slowly returning. The morning sunlight broke through the tall windows of the mansion, painting golden patterns on the floor as the widower sat at the breakfast table staring at his twins who were laughing with the nanny. And though the sound of their joy should have been familiar, it startled him because he realized it had been years since such laughter filled the house. Years since the shadows of grief had allowed something so pure to bloom. And he watched closely, still uncertain if this peace was temporary or if it truly meant their home was healing. And as the nanny poured juice into the children's glasses, humming softly under her breath, he noticed the twins clinging to her, their tiny hands gripping her dress as though they feared she might vanish if they let go. And in that sight he saw not just comfort but trust, a trust that had taken root in only a short time, and it made his heart ache because he knew how fragile such bonds could be. Yet at the same time, he felt something stir within him, a realization that perhaps this woman had not simply been hired to care for his children, but had been sent into their lives for a reason far deeper, though he could not yet explain it. And as the days passed, he found himself observing more, listening more, even joining in the small moments that once felt too heavy after his wife's death, like sitting on the floor to build castles with wooden blocks, reading bedtime stories aloud while the nanny listened quietly from the doorway, or walking together in the garden as the children ran between them, their laughter echoing like music through the trees. And little by little, the mansion that once felt like a tomb began to feel alive again. Yet underneath the joy there was a lingering tension, a question that weighed on the widower's heart. Could he allow himself to open up again, to trust someone, with not just his children's happiness but his own? And could he accept that the nanny herself carried wounds that had not yet fully healed? Wounds she often tried to hide behind her gentle smile. And one evening, when a storm raged outside and the thunder frightened the twins, he saw her gather them close, whispering that fear was only strong if you let it stay in your heart. And then she sang that same haunting lullaby, her voice shaking as though the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm she had once lived through. And when the children finally slept, the widower stepped forward and asked her quietly why that song always sounded like both a prayer and a farewell. And though she hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, she admitted that it was the last song she had ever sung to her own child before tragedy stole him away, and that in singing it now, she was not just calming the twins but also speaking to the child she would never hold again. And at that confession, the widower felt something break inside him, for he realized their pain was different yet the same. They were two souls who had lost a piece of themselves, both pretending to be strong for the sake of those they loved. And in that moment, the unspoken wall between them began to crumble. And over the weeks that followed, the house transformed further, not because of grand gestures, but because of simple acts. The nanny teaching the twins to bake cookies while flour covered their tiny hands, the widower sitting late into the night talking with her about fears he had never voiced, the children drawing pictures of all of them together as if instinctively declaring her part of the family. And one afternoon, when the twins handed him a picture of their family with her drawn right beside them, Labeled Mom, he froze, his throat tightening as he realized the truth that even children understood. She had restored what they had lost, not by replacing their mother, but by filling the empty spaces with love. And though the word family had once felt broken, now it seemed whole again, and the widower finally understood that a home was not made of walls or wealth, but of hearts willing to heal together. And as he looked at the nanny across the room, seeing the way she smiled at the twins with a tenderness that came from her very soul, he knew their lives had entered a new chapter. And though grief would always linger like a shadow, it no longer defined them, because their home had been restored by the most unexpected bond of all. And for the first time in years, he dared to believe that tomorrow might carry light instead of sorrow.